Was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, at Rodriguez Army Hospital. My father was in the Navy, March 1st, 1962.
Okay. What was your early childhood like?
Well, we moved around a lot to Navy bases. We were stationed different places. We were stationed in Guam for 3 years. My mom actually is from Guam.
Okay.
So we did get a chance to visit Taiwan, Japan, some of those places, traveling around on Space A. But kind of moved over all around until about 6th grade. Then Norfolk and Virginia Beach is a huge naval complex. So we didn't move, my dad changed jobs, but we were always kind of in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, from, I don't know, probably around 72, 73 on.
So you were young enough to, you were young enough but also aware of the conflicts that were going on overseas, being part of a military family.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Actually going to elementary school in Guam, we would see the flatbed trailers full of 500-pound bombs get offloaded on ships and take them up to Anderson Air Force Base where they were loading them up on B-52s so if you're going to school, you're in a school bus, and right next to you there's a truckload of 500-pound bombs. So, yeah.
Was there any conversation around your household about the conflict that was going on in Vietnam at that time?
There definitely was discussions because we'd see it on the TV, but my dad being in the Navy, it was pretty much a one-sided conversation at that point.
But by the time that you got of draft age, was the draft still in effect?
No.
Okay, so I had the same thing.
Right.
Happened to me. So being in a military family, was there any pressure on you to then continue on with the military tradition?
Not really. Although my brother spent 30 years in the Army, and I spent almost 27 years in the Coast Guard. I think public service was always ingrained into it, but not necessarily military service. So we were never forced into it, but and probably one of the reasons why my brother joined the Army, I joined the Coast Guard. At that point, the Navy was doing 9-month deployments, and so the Coast Guard, our ships are smaller, and we'll go on 2 or 3 month patrols. And they're not nuclear capable, so we have to pull in every 10 days or every 2 weeks to get some fuel. So you'd actually get some Liberty ports. You pull in and out a little bit more often than a Navy ship. So, I don't know, I guess that's why I end up joining the Coast Guard, I guess.
Well, let's back up a little bit. What were your aspirations in high school? What were some of the things you were thinking of that you might do with yourself?
Not much. It was kind of one of those things, we were expected to go to college, but I probably didn't have a major in mind. It was just, that's what everybody's going to college, what are you going to major in? So I ended up majoring in sociology. So I just took a bunch of courses, really like criminal justice, anthropology, sociology, all those things. So that's what I ended up majoring in.
Okay.
Of course, can't do much with a bachelor's degree in sociology,
All these sides, tell me about it.
even back in the the mid '80s. So I actually bartended for 5 years after school, and one of those things you can only bartend for so long. It was one of those things I was getting antsy to do something, and I was living in San Diego at the time, and had just dropped off my then girlfriend to the airport, and the Coast Guard base is right across the street from the airport in San Diego. So I was just driving by, got a wild hair, pulled in, talked to the recruiter. 2 weeks later, I'm off to boot camp. So
It was that simple?
I had to take a test. You took an ASVAB test, which is their vocational battery that you take, and I scored pretty well on it. And the guy said, well, when do you want to go? And I'm like, I don't know. He goes, well, we can get you into a physical. So a couple days later, I got the physical and passed that. And they kind of said, well, when do you want to go? And I said, well, when's the next, class convening or whatever date? And it was like a couple weeks. And I went back, gave my boss 2 weeks notice, and I was off.
What's your family think of this? This is not like something you sat down and discussed this. You're driving by and then suddenly you show up and go, hey, I'm going to join.
It did create a little bit of heartburn because, my dad retired as a captain in the Navy and my brother went to West Point. So the fact that I enlisted didn't go over too well because they're going, well, you have a college degree. Why don't you go to OCS or something? And I don't know. I couldn't really tell you why. It just didn't really enter into my mind. I kind of wanted to go back to school. So the idea was to join for a few years, get the GI Bill, go back out, get a graduate degree in something, and then just move on with life. So never had any plans of making it a career. But, you know, the longer you stay in and meet friends and adapt to the lifestyle and the mission, just, you know, time to re-enlist. Okay, you sign the papers. Then, you know, once you've signed up once, you know, you're talking, you've been in 6, 7 years, and you're going, hey, I only need to make it to 20 to get a retirement check for the rest of my life. And, so made it to 20, and at this point, my wife and kids have been following me around at this point. So I kind of gave her the option at that point. I said, well, we can pull the trigger on this. I'll retire tomorrow if you guys are tired of moving. And no, they all said, no, we've got a couple more moves left in us. So.
Right, well, let's walk back to, all right, you've been recruited now, you went past your physical. Where did you go from there?
Cape May, New Jersey is where Coast Guard.
What was the purpose of that? Why did you go there?
That's boot camp, recruit training. Every service has an accession school, I guess you call it. But so it's 8 weeks long, and they, you know, they shade.
Let's walk through that. Because Coast Guard boot camp, I've talked to Army boot camp, I've talked to Marine boot camp. So give us an idea. Did you go there by bus?
No, flew, because I got recruited out of San Diego. So we flew to Philadelphia, and then we got loaded up on a bus.
You arrive, and a guy walks on the bus, and he says, okay, you're going to have pheasant under glass, you're going to have wonderful food, you're going to be sleeping until 11 o'clock in the morning.
Absolutely, it's Coast Guard, it's not the Marine Corps.
Tell me
No.
about the bus pulled up.
Well, the bus pulled up, and, you know, I was kind of an idiot, because I'm coming from San Diego, and it's, when did it start? It started in February 2nd is when I started boot camp, in '87. So in San Diego, it's warm. So, of course, I was the only guy that went there without long johns. And it's cold because there's snow on the ground. So you're on the bus, and they start yelling at you, and they go stand in the yellow square. And they have little yellow squares lined up, but there's snow on the ground, so you can't see where the yellow squares are. And so they're yelling at you, so you're kind of kicking away the snow to try to find out where this yellow square is that you're supposed to stand in. So, you know, and so it just starts yelling. I mean, it's a transition. You know, you get your head shaved, and they teach you how to wear a uniform, and they yell at you, and there's a fair amount of push-ups and running and punishments and stuff like that until you finally graduate.
Well, how did you react to boot camp, though? Some people adapt fairly well. Some people really have a hard time with it. How did you feel?
It was fine. You know,
in shape?
I was in shape.
All
right. So, you know, yeah, the physical portion wasn't all that difficult. I'd grown up in a military household, you know, grew up yes sir, no sir. So it was just like anything else. It is a transition, because nothing's like boot camp but boot camp. But you know, you're with 50 or 60 other folks, and you're all going through the same thing. You know, there were a few people crying that first night. You know, a few people dropped out within the first couple weeks. Most of us made it through fine and graduated. But you know, they go over. I'm sure the different services is a little bit different. I mean, we go through marlin spike seamanship and learn how to tie knots, and you know, learn how to be a boat crewman. You know, basic nautical terminology and stuff like that. I imagine the Army is different, Air Force is different like that. So they get you prepared for your first duty station, and mine was a Coast Guard cutter, a 378-foot Coast Guard cutter out of Alameda, California.
Did you make that choice, or was that given to you, or how did that work?
It was actually given to you, because what happened, they don't do it this way anymore, but where you graduated in your boot camp class is, if you were number one in the class, then they put 54 billets up on the chalkboard. And if you were number one, you went up there and you scratched one out, and then they wrote it down. And then number two guy goes up there and he picks his. So that's the way they used to do it.
And where did you fit on that list?
I did graduate first. So I did get a first pick.
All right, so first pick means?
I could, of all the billets that are listed, you could pick any one of them. So, like I say, there were 54, I believe there were 54 people in our class.
Okay.
50-something. And that's what went down. So if you graduate at the bottom of the class, you didn't get a choice.
What choice did you make, and why?
Well, I wanted to get on a ship. You know, I'm in the Coast Guard. I don't want to go to a land station. I mean, let's go experience what this is all about. And then, that's what happened. Go on board on a ship as a seaman apprentice is not the most glamorous thing either in the world, because, you start out, you're on what they call deck force or mess cooking. You're not doing the cook, but you're washing the dishes, you're scrubbing the pots and pans, that's probably your first, 30, 40, 50, 60 days until a new crop of boot camp graduates and then comes to the ship. So
walk us through the process then. You're washing dishes, you're cleaning floors, that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Where did you go from there?
Well, there you kind of graduate to deck force and you do become a deck seaman. So at that point, depending on what evolution the ship is going through, you have a job. So for special sea detail or anchor detail, I was a phone talker up on the foc'sle. So the people on the foc'sle that are actually letting go the anchor or whatever, they're taking orders from the bridge, and they relay those through a sound-powered telephone. So I had the little sound-powered telephone headset on, and so when they go, okay, let's drop the anchor, 4 shots on deck, and that's what you'll do. And on an anchor chain, every shot, which is 90 feet, there's a painted link, one of the links. So as that's paying out, you're repeating back up to the bridge, 1 shot on deck, 2 shots on deck. So as soon as it gets there, then you stop. And then there's someone on the brake, that's the brakeman, and then he gets told to stop the brake. And then you figure whether you're going to be dragging anchor or not, or what your swing circle is, depending on what the weather's doing. And, if you're in a harbor, there's a lot more to anchoring if you're in a harbor close to other boats, because, you're swinging on the hook, and that's what they call it, because the boat moves. It's not like parking a car. So depending on tides, current, winds, that boat is going to be swinging around the one point that it's anchored to the bottom of the sea. So even when you're anchored, there's still an anchor watch. You're not underway, you're not being the helmsman driving the ship, but you definitely have to look at the anchor. And if you start dragging anchor or moving, then, you just got to reposition the ship.
So where were you on your first duties? Where were you?
The 378-foot cutters are called high-endurance cutters. And the ones on the West Coast, their basic mission is to go to Alaska and do fisheries patrols up in Alaska. I'm sure you've heard Alaska, fishing in Alaska is pretty dangerous. 5 or 6 people die every year. So we would go up there because there's a helicopter on the fantail, and we're basically kind of a search and rescue platform if something goes wrong with one of the boats, as well as a medical facility, and also to enforce U.S. federal fisheries laws. So we would board boats, and I got on a boarding team. We would board boats, and when you would count fish, because the way that they regulate, depending on what fishery it was, and everyone was a little bit different. At the end of every 24-hour period, the captains of the boat would tally up their fish and they would radio that in. And once they got up to a certain amount of metric tons of whatever fish they're fishing for, cod, pollock, or whatever, they would close the fishery. And then there were certain species that were prohibited species. So when you were going and spot checking the catch, like if it's a pollock fishery, you don't want to have sablefish, which is also called black cod. So you would look for prohibited species because they couldn't keep those on the boat. So even if they inadvertently caught them, they'd have to throw them overboard. So you'd look for that. You'd look if they were strip and roe. A lot of people, they would get the female fish and they would strip the roe because that's worth more than the fish. So you do that, and then you check all their safety equipment. You check out their life jackets, their exposure suits, life rafts, flares, emergency radio equipment, all that stuff. And then you either let them go, you cite them for minor things, or, which has happened a couple of times, you'll find them, say, fishing someplace they shouldn't, like a stellar sea lion rookery or something. We caught a couple boats in there, and then you actually seize the boat. And it's called a prize crew, and then you take possession of that boat and you take it to Kodiak, Alaska, and then the U.S. attorneys figure out what they're going to do with this boat.
What would you say, from your perspective, the relationship between the fishing industry, the fishermen, so to speak, the people who are fishing, and the Coast Guard?
Love-hate. And it really depends. I mean, if they're in trouble and they're sinking, of course they love us. The 378s I was on 3 of them. They have gas turbines. They'll go 30 knots, but 30 knots in the North Pacific, but the helicopter can do 160 knots. So, if someone's sinking, you launch the helo, they're going to get there. So that's the respect. They like the fact that we're there in case something goes wrong. But if you do board them and, cite them or fine them $100,000 for doing something they shouldn't do, that's kind of bad. So a lot of times you will knock heads, and if the weather kicks up too, there are a couple times we actually had to spend the night on the ship that we just sighted because the weather kicked up, so the small boat from our ship couldn't make it over for you to go down the Jacob's ladder to get on that ship. So, it's really bad feeling when you've just handed this guy a ticket for a pretty good chunk of change, and you get a call from the captain saying, hey, weather's kicking up, we got 8-footers, and there's no way the small boat can pick you up, so you guys got to hang out. So you're not happy about it, and they're not happy, because now they have to feed you, and they have to put you up for the night, and you're hoping the weather clears in the morning. And then occasionally, if you're in the middle of a fishing fleet, you'll actually get lost. The radar men are supposed to be tracking what boat you're on, and normally we wouldn't send out more than 3 boarding teams. And, you're A, B, or C, so you think you're getting tracked, and then you call back to the ship, and you go, okay, this is boarding team Alpha, we're done, we're ready for pickup. And you're going, oh yeah, you're the red and white trawler right there off our port bow, right? And you're looking at a blue hull, and you go, no. So then you get lost, then they got to find you. So, eventually it all works out.
Did you find in that particular period, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but in that particular period, did you ever feel like you were in danger? Not from the fishermen. The biggest danger, like any underway evolution, when it involves a transfer between vessels, that's the hardest one right there, because they do have a ladder that goes over the side, and you're coming on board with a small boat. Say it's, a 7-meter rigid hull inflatable boat, and it goes on side. But, you got to remember, you're in an environment where the boat you're on is pitching, rolling, yawing, and the boat you're trying to get on is pitching, rolling, yawing, and then you have waves. So it's really incumbent on the coxswain who's driving the small boat. Your trust had to be in him, and because a lot of times you're way up here, but he's looking behind and he's looking at the waves, and he knows when that boat's coming up. So you're hanging on the ladder, and when he says jump, you just let go, because you might be 30 foot above where that boat is, but he's timed the wave enough, and you get a lee. You're on the lee side of the boat anyway, so there's a little bit less wave action and wind. But then he's coming up right when you're coming down, and 9 times out of 10 you're just boom. Oh, okay, thanks, Phil. And so we had one really good coxswain. Phil Will was his name, and he was just a master at it. If you were ever going out in rough weather, you always want to get him. So that lasted for how long, that particular Alaska part of your career?
Well, probably close to 7 years, because I was on 3 different cutters.
Okay.
So the first 2 cutters I was on, I was enlisted, and then after OCS, I went back to a cutter as an officer.
Well, let's go back then. So the first cutter, is it like you just finished your tour of duty on there and then they transferred it somewhere else? Or you requested it, or how
You do. Well, it's called a dream sheet, for obvious reasons. You put 9 choices down, ranked in order, and then you got a couple of slots you can put down places you don't want to go. So hopefully they would honor at least one of your. They try to honor the detailers whose fate is in your hand. Your hands are in his fate. They try to give you one of your top 3 choices, but it's all needs of the service. They call them orders for a reason. They don't call them suggestions. They come in with your order. Hey, your orders came in low. Where are you going? Oh, you're going to the Coast Guard Cutter Boutwell. Okay.
Well, being somebody who's never been in the Coast Guard, how do you know what's available to you, and how do you personally rank what you want to do as opposed to where you don't want to go?
Well, what it is every year, about a third of the Coast Guard transfers. So there's a shopping list, and depending on your rank and your rate. So I was a sonar technician by trade. So even though I was involved in fisheries boardings, I was still a sonar technician. So I'm still standing watch as a sonar technician and doing electronics maintenance and upkeep and all that stuff. That's your day job, and then if your boarding team gets called, you go do that. But yeah, you finish up your A school, which is what they call it, and you're a minimally trained sonar tech at that point. And so then you go to the ship, and you've got a chief and a first class and a couple second class petty officers, and you're the brand new third class petty officer right out of boot camp. And you learn skills on how to get there. One of our major jobs as a sonar tech, our captain liked to fish. And there's a shallow area in the Bering Sea called Albatross Banks. And as the halibut migrate, they all migrate toward this shallow area of the Bering Sea. So he would always come down and say, okay, guys, find Albatross Banks. So we would go up there and we would have to find the shallowest point of Albatross Banks. So when we weren't doing anything, like say a Sunday afternoon or something, when you were on kind of a holiday routine, unless you had watch, you could drop a hook in the water and you could actually go fishing. So it all depends on the captain and where he wants to go.
So you have this every period of time, there's this sort of wish list, and you look at it and you go, I don't want to go there. Oh, that looks good.
Right.
How did you determine which one
Well,
you didn't want or did want?
I think the easiest way, I grew up in Virginia Beach and Norfolk, so I didn't want to go back there because I'd already been there. So places I would go, as long as it was a place I hadn't been to before, I'm going, that sounds good. And, the Coast Guard, unlike the Air Force, you could be stuck at a missile base in Minot, North Dakota. The Coast Guard is in cool places. I mean, I've been stationed in New Orleans, Key West, Portland, Maine, San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, Colorado Springs. So Grand Haven, was stationed here in Grand Haven. So you look at your choices, they're all pretty good, cool coastal towns because that's where the Coast Guard is. So, but like I say, your choices are limited to what's available that transfer year. So if nothing's available where you want to go, but you've called the next duty station where you want, and say a guy is transferring next year, you could ask to extend for a year to try to get in the right cycle to get that job, or you could short tour, maybe leave a year early or whatever. So, there's a little bit of horse trading around with that, but you, again, always got to get the captain's recommendation and the detailer's got to sign off on it. So just because there's your dream job somewhere, like there's a small boat station on Lake Tahoe. Everybody wants to go to the small boat station in South Lake Tahoe, but, there's 12 people there. And so chances of you getting that small boat station on Lake Tahoe are pretty slim. I've never known anybody personally that's ever served there. But somebody is staffing it up. So there's a small boat station on Lake Havasu too. Everybody wants to go there, but chances are you're not going to get that job.
So what was your second, the orders for your second ship then? You chose one and you got it, or you didn't get it?
I got it.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And so what was that?
What's that?
Where was the second one?
The second was out of Alameda, California too. Well, what it was is my rate was a sonar technician, and there was only one ship in the Coast Guard that had sonar technicians on it. And that was this class of high endurance cutter. So basically my choices were very few. The only real land billets they had was teaching at the Sonar Technician A School, which is actually the Navy's Fleet Anti-Submarine Warfare Training Center in San Diego. They do have a handful of Coast Guard instructors there, and there's a Coast Guard class going through that with the Navy counterpart. So you don't have a Coast Guard class. You might have a couple of Coasties in a Navy class of say 20 people. But pretty much your choices were what 378 you want to go on. So if you like being underway, it's a great job. And I was young and I was single, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. And some of the places that we deployed, I mean, we went to Japan one trip. One trip we did a Westpac. A lot of islands in the Western Pacific, they don't have doctors or dentists. So we had a bunch of Navy doctors and dentists on board, and we would go to various places in Micronesia and stuff and just stop, and they would spend a day or two there, basically just giving some basic medical care, immunizations, stuff like that, just looking around to make sure that the general population was okay, and then we'd move on to the next one. So, went to Majuro, went to Kwajalein, went to Kosrae, stopped in Guam for a trip, of course the Hawaiian Islands, Midway. So that was all really interesting to me. I mean, like again, as long as I was going to someplace I hadn't been to before, I was up for it.
During the period of time when you stopped over, what was your downtime like? What kind of the types of things? You look like just from what we've talked about, you were very adventurous. You want to go places and see things. So what did you actually do? I mean, keep in mind, when I was when I was growing up, I had guys that were in the military, their kids would stay at the PX and stay at the movies. They wouldn't even go out to see what the culture was like. How about you?
Well, a lot of it depends on where you pull in. So if you pull in a place, of course, a typical sailor story, but yeah, you're first probably beeline it to the closest bar, to be honest with you. But then you'd look around and depend on how long you're going to be there or what alert status you were in. So a lot of times you were on a recall status, like they call it Bravo 6, which means if the call came out, the boat had to get underway within 6 hours. So you couldn't wander that far away from the ship because you knew that if you hear the horn, you hear the whistle going off and word gets around, hey, report back to the ship in 40 minutes because we have to get underway. There's a search and rescue case somewhere. Other times you actually hit a mid-patrol break where you're there for maybe 3 days, 4 days, and unless you have duty, you basically have the time off. So a lot of times that's what people would do. If you went to Japan, and of course we're all living on the ship at this point. So usually a bunch of us would get together, rent a hotel room just so you didn't have to go back to the ship, and you knew if you didn't have duty for the next couple of days, you could just go explore Tokyo, which was actually kind of funny because when I went there, I'm going, okay, I'm going to have sushi. I'm having real sushi in Japan, but most of the crew, they're beelining to McDonald's or KFC, and I'm just, there's a group of us who were just like, really? We're in Tokyo. You're going to go to McDonald's in Tokyo? But yeah, they would go there, look around a little bit, go back to ship, watch movies. So it just depends on what you want to do.
But what did you do in Tokyo, for example?
Well, like I say, we ate a lot, ate some good food. We went to a couple karaoke bars. We sang songs in English and they sang songs in Japanese. We didn't have any idea what either one was saying, but they were fun. You walk into a bar in a foreign country, and a lot of places where the Coast Guard pulls in, not necessarily Tokyo, but a U.S. ship hasn't been there since maybe World War II. So we pulled in this little town in Australia. This is a better town story. And like the whole town is on the dock welcoming you. I mean, there's a band on the pier because no U.S. vessel has pulled in there since World War II. So then you go there and you go out, they know exactly that you're off the boat that just tied up in the harbor. So it's real easy to get to know people. If you're someone like me, I think the Australian accent's kind of cool, but they think your accent's cool. So, you'd go in there, like I say, you'd find the nearest watering hole and you'd sit down and you'd start talking to them, and then you'd find out, okay, where do we go? What's the, besides going to the Sydney Opera House or something, where would you go? Whatever, and then they'd tell you, and then, maybe the next day they'd come back, you give them a tour of the ship. Just.
I've been to both places, Australia and New Zealand. They call you Yank. Hey, Yank! They like Americans.
Right. And although, I'll go back to nuclear power. Although no Coast Guard cutter has any nuclear power, we couldn't pull into New Zealand because the U.S. can't confirm or deny if there's any nuclear stuff on any of their military vessels. So, it's a big white ship with a big red stripe on the side. We're not trying to hide from anybody.
So that was your second ship. What was the third, and how did you get that?
Well, I did get into boardings, and that's maritime law enforcement. But we were just doing fisheries boardings. So the 7th Coast Guard District is actually out of Miami, Florida. And, we'd all seen Miami Vice or whatever. So they had these things called tactical law enforcement teams, and one was in Key West. So that's where I wanted to go. So I said, I want to go do some real law enforcement. It's all law enforcement, but I want to go do drug board. I want to go do counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean. So I was lucky enough to get that. And really what put it over the edge, the Coast Guard, after the Cold War was over, started phasing out the sonar technicians because the Cold War was over and all our funding for sonar equipment was from the Navy, all the training and all the equipment. So the Navy's going, hey, we're losing money. We're not going to fund the Coast Guard anymore. So they got rid of the sonar technicians. They pulled all the gear off the cutters. And so I was kind of out of rate, but just being in the right place at the right time, they didn't know for sure whether they were going to get rid of sonar techs. There are only about 120 of us in the entire Coast Guard. So they were offering bonus money to stay in. So I re-enlisted. They gave me $15,000 and they gave me Key West. So I'm like, this is pretty cool. So we go there, and that's when the Navy still had their hydrofoil squadron, which is a ship that actually comes out of the water, and it's on 3 fins, actually, and they have a DC-10 jet engine on it, and they can do 60-plus knots, whatever. And so this was one of their major interdiction platforms for drugs. So that was our major job, was to get underway on the hydrofoils, which were all home ported in Key West, and then we'd go out for 2 or 3 weeks in the Yucatan Channel or somewhere, wherever we had intelligence that there was some drugs being smuggled or whatever. And a lot of times we do a lot of nothing. You know, you board a lot of boats and you see a lot of nothing. Every now and then you'll get some good intel and you'll make an arrest. So it's
How dangerous was that?
well, a little bit more dangerous, but I never really felt endangered because, to be honest with you, even the times where we made arrests and found significant marijuana, never made a cocaine bust. It was all marijuana. But you know, you've got the helicopter hovering. You know, if you're working with a platform that has a helicopter, or they see this Navy ship, you know, with a what was the, I don't know, whatever gun, I can't even remember the size of the gun, but it has 8 harpoons on the back, which are, you know, surfaced or missiles that can sink things. So they see this ship here, they see the Coast Guard boarding team, they know that you can have assets to bear. So most of the times, I mean, they're leaning over the rail with their hands behind their back. I mean, they're not even going to fight it at that point because, you know, you have broad authority to do really whatever you want if you get a statement of no objection from the host country. So on the high seas, not much is illegal on the high seas because they're stateless. No one owns the high seas. So really piracy and the slave trade are like the only illegal things that's always illegal. But we would have to get permission to board these boats because they're not U.S. flagged. So the Coast Guard has jurisdiction on U.S. flagged vessels anywhere in the world, unless they're in the territorial sea of another sovereign nation. So say the boat is flagged by Vanuatu or France or whatever, you go through a PD-27 process, which is you see a boat, it's a target of interest, and you've got some intel, but it's not a U.S. flag vessel. So you would have to call back to the ship, or the ship would call the Coast Guard headquarters, and they'd get in touch with the State Department, and they would get in touch with whoever country was that and said, hey, we want your permission to go on board this vessel and enforce U.S. federal law. So you would get that statement of no objection from whatever country it was, and then you could enforce U.S. federal law. So a big thing on a boat underway is space accountability because people make hidden compartments. So some of them are really easy if you see a false bulkhead and a fresh can of paint and it just looks out of place. Some of them are that stupid. But other times you have a tape measure and you're going, okay, the beam of this boat is X amount of feet or X amount of meters. And you get your tape measure out and you're going, hey, I'm missing 2 feet on this. What's here? So, you know, you get the drill out and, you know, you have a little borescope and you can put it in there and you can look around. And, you know, if you're lucky, you can find stuff. The team leader at the time I was on, we did board another boat and there was some space accountability problems overhead. So he had a drill that was going like this and boom, and white powder fell into his fate. But that ended up not being a bust because, of course, as soon as we find it, they're saying, well, we're CI, we're confidential informants, we're working for the DEA. And we're going, yeah, sure. Yeah, you're all confidential informants at this point. But they actually were. So we took the boat over, take them back to Key West. The DEA was waiting on the pier. Thanks, Coast Guard, now get away. You go, well, if there's a little bit of interagency cooperation, but they didn't trust us with their intelligence. So, you know, so we're just going out, hey, it's a target of interest. Let's go see what we can find. So there's always some funny stories like that.
Miami Vice dealt with that sort of thing once in a while, because, you know, the 2 Miami Vice guys are always complaining because they get compromised or something like that.
And then Customs a lot of times would steal busts from us because, you know, Customs jurisdiction ends at the 12-mile point, and so our jurisdiction's everywhere. So say we'd be shadowing a boat. You know, shadowing it, you know, put on deceptive lighting at night, staying just over the horizon where the radar can pick them up, but they can't see it. And then and you're radioing all this in, so everyone knows that, hey, we got a boat, we got a target, we're going to do it. And this happened a few times that you'd get inside the 12-mile limit, and Customs at the time had this really fast catamaran called Blue Thunder. And you'd call in, and the minute you cross that 12-mile line, Customs would go, we got it. And Blue Thunder would come screaming out of nowhere, and you'd look at him, really?
Because that added to their numbers.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely it did. But, you know, you might have been shadowing this guy for 7 or 8 days. And then suddenly it's just taken away from you. And, of course, on every boat you wanted to, you know, you have a marijuana leaf for a cocaine star. So whenever you made a bust, you got a little sticker. So everyone wanted to have the stickers on their shit, you know.
So how long did that particular tour do to you?
That was 2 years.
Okay. And why did you leave, or what was your thoughts about going somewhere?
Well, I would have stayed there longer, but at that point, the sonar techs were totally out of the Coast Guard. So at that point, as a sonar technician, you had a couple of choices. One, no matter what was left on your contract, they'd let you out if you wanted to get out because they had no job for you. Two, you could cross-rate. You could become an electronics technician or a radarman or a fire control technician and keep your stripes. Or they would send you to any A school that you wanted to in the Coast Guard, but you would come out a third-class petty officer. So I had just made first class, so I wasn't willing to lose 2 stripes by starting over school. So since I did have a degree, I put a package in for OCS. Because I looked at that as my option, I go, well, what am I going to do? I go, I really don't want to be those other 3 rates, the electronic technician, fire controller, radarman. I didn't want to start over. So, I mean, my plan at that point was I was either going to get out or get picked up and go to OCS. So I put a package into OCS and got accepted.
Where'd you go?
It's Yorktown, Virginia, which is where Coast Guard Officer Candidate School is. It's at New London, Connecticut now, where the academy is. So that's.
So what was the process now? So you're coming in, you've already had the experience of being there. Now you're the new guy, so to speak, at this new school. What was this like?
Well, it's a little bit, because if you're coming from the fleet, about half of my class in OCS were enlisted sailors. So you had a bunch of people that were straight out of college, 22-year-old kids, you know, and then you had some of us with anywhere 2, 4, 6 years experience in the Coast Guard. So, you know, they're going in with long hair and civilian clothes. You're reporting on board in uniform. So it's a little bit easier, and everyone says, well, how did you do so well in officer candidate school? But when you first start, the first couple of tests, because it's tailored to everybody, you know, they'll throw a picture up on the thing and said, what class of ship is this? And it's a 378-foot high endurance cutter. And I've been on 2 of them at this point. So of course you're like, of course you know what it is. You don't have to, so for the first half of OCS, any class that you took, if you were coming from the fleet, you got hundreds on everything without even studying. And then most of the physical stuff, you're used to it because, you know, you've gone through all the swim training and you've gone through all the physical fitness stuff. But I guess the hardest thing is some kids weren't in shape. Most people really were in shape, but some people had never even seen the ocean before. I mean, you know, you get a kid grew up in Michigan, you know, went to Michigan State. Suddenly he's in Yorktown, Virginia. He's seen water before, but he's never seen salt water. So, you know, kind of a culture shift with that.
Was there any, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but was there any kind of sense of camaraderie amongst the guys that had been in against or was supportive of these other guys, or was there, you know, what was that like?
It was really supportive.
Okay.
Because, you know, learning how to shine shoes is an art. You know, no one knows how to shine. You're not born. So that's one of the hardest things, and pressing your uniform correctly and all like that. But pretty much everyone that had been in the fleet was, you know, and I think they intentionally, you know, when you're in a room with 3 other people, you know, they make sure that you have 3 newbies and then you have 1 old salt or whatever, so you can tell them, no, that's not the way you fold your underwear. That's not the way you press your uniform. Right? Yeah, you know, so no, but it really is help. But then they can help you out too, you know, because again, they've got a fresh perspective. You know, again, as insular as the military is, you know, you've been on a 378-foot ship with 150 people on it for 3 years, or part of a really small, tight-knit 6-man law enforcement team for a couple of years. That's kind of your worldview at that point. So it was really good just talking to people that hadn't been in the military for a while, you know, just getting that fresh perspective.
So what was the actual, you're now doing classes, you finished up your test, then what happens? What's the step-by-step?
Well, what you do is you have 1 week where you're just studying rules of the road, because if you're going to be an underway officer of the deck, you need to pass the rules of the road, which is navigation. So you spend a whole week studying the nav rules and then taking a test. You got to get above 80 to pass. And then you actually go on a cruise.
And you have to get 80 to pass.
You got to get 80. I can't remember. I'll be honest, I can't.
Okay.
I can't remember. I did graduate number 1. I did graduate number 1 in my OCS class too. But I can't remember what I got on the nav rules test.
That's
So you do that, then you actually go on a cruise.
Yeah.
So my long cruise, which lasted, I don't know, I think it was 10 days, 10, 11 days, was actually on the Coast Guard Cutter Mackinac here. So that was, again, my first taste of the Great Lakes. I mean, you know, I've lived on the West Coast, East Coast, but never been in the Midwest. So you do that, then you come back, you take a few more tests, they expose you to, all aspects of the Coast Guard. The training center in Yorktown, a lot of their ACE schools and training schools are there. So they have a firefighting school there. So you go through basic shipboard firefighting, which most of us people that were coming from fleet had already done it. But so you're going through, and they actually light things on fire. You put the whole turnout gear on, you're putting your Scott Air pack on, and you're going in there and fighting a fire. So that's kind of intimidating for someone who hasn't done it before. So, you go, okay, I'll be the lead hose man. You just stand behind me. We'll get through this one. We'll do this evolution. I'll lead. Then the next one you lead. So you're going through things, classes like that just to get you prepared. But the problem with Coast Guard OCS, at that point, everybody that graduated from the Coast Guard Academy had to go to a ship. So there were very few shipboard billets for officer candidate school folks. And in my class, there were only 3 billets. 3 underway billets. So I knew I wanted to go back to a ship. So my dream sheet at that point, I just put any afloat unit. It was my line because I want to go back to a ship. And you want to telegraph to the detailer how serious you are. You give me a buoy tender out of Kodiak, Alaska. Okay, at least it's a vessel. I don't want to be stuck in a shore job. And the sad thing about the OCS graduates, a lot of them, they'll go to Coast Guard headquarters or a district office or an area office, and they're doing paperwork job, and I'm going, I didn't join the Coast Guard to do that. So I did. I got another ship, another 378 out of Alameda, California. And that was another thing. I said any afloat unit. So I had been a sonar technician, which is a deck rating. So most of my time had not been in the engine room. And of course, I get my orders that say student engineer, Coast Guard Cutter Sherman, Alameda, California. So I'm like, so suddenly I'm down in the engine room, hand over hand in pipes drawing the sewage system, and the lube oil system, the auxiliary saltwater system. So, that's, as a student engineer, the first thing you do, you start standing, breaking in your security watches, but okay, you have to draw these ship systems. Most of the people that are going to be student engineers or engineer officers in training, they have an engineering background. I didn't know what the symbology for a pump was, so luckily there were some people there that knew what was going on. And so you get through it, and you finally get qualified, and then you stand watch, and you become a full-fledged member of the crew. A little bit different as an officer going to a ship, because at least the ship I was on, the XO, the executive officer, kind of a hard ass, but unless you were qualified, you weren't really welcome in the wardroom, which is where you eat and which is where you watch movies and is kind of the lounge. You can read like that. And I was standing watch in the engine room. So, a lot of times if you're standing the watch, the 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. watch, dinner comes in between that. Of course, you've been in the engine room for a couple hours before dinner's served, and so you come up, you're reeking of diesel fuel. And so the XO, Lowe, go change. You're not eating dinner. So then you got to change, clean up a little bit, change, choke and puke your food down in 5 or 10 minutes because you only have like 20 minutes. Then you go back, change back into your coveralls, and go back down the engine room. And then the only time you were really welcome in the wardroom to watch movies is the night before you pulled in, as cabin fever night or whatever. And we were always pulling into San Francisco, so they would always show San Francisco movies. So I've seen the Presidio probably a million times. So that's what it was. But if you were just sitting there, just having a cup of coffee, the senior officers would go, don't you have PQS, personal qualification standard? Don't you have PQS to work on, Lowe? What are you doing here? You've been here more, you stop more than a couple minutes. Someone's riding your ass about. Why aren't you out doing something, getting qualified? And when I first reported on board, we graduated in September, the Maine propulsion assistant, who's an old warrant officer who owns the engine room, 20 years at sea, all in the engine room. 3 of us, brand new student engineers, he goes, my job is to get you assholes qualified because I'm not standing duty Thanksgiving, Christmas, or New Year's. You got it? So it's my job to get you qualified because I ain't standing it. So you're like, okay, Ricky, sure, whatever. So you do that, and you do what you got to do, get qualified. Then I had a boarding background, so normally the engineer officers, they're not doing boardings because they're busy down the engine room. But since I had already had 2 cutters with Alaska fisheries experience, so I was thrown into that mix too. So that's kind of a rough day when you're standing watch on board ship. And I ended up being the damage control assistant. So my workspace wasn't even the engine room, but you're standing 8 hours of watch a day anyway. So before you ever even do your job, and they either have the 4 to 8s, the 8 to 12s, or the 12 to 4s, the mids. So if you have the 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. watch, then you start your work day. Then you have the 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. watch. So you stay in your first watch, you get a little bit of breakfast, you think, oh yeah, I got some work to do, and then they go, boarding team Alpha, away. So then you go, okay, you go get your Mustang suit on, draw your weapon, get loaded up, go do your boarding, come back reeking of fish. So then you got to get cleaned up to go stand watch in the engine room. So, so then you're taking one shower just to get rid of the fish guts on you, and then you're going down the engine room, then you smell like diesel fuel when you come back. So.
Well, so far, with the exception of the drug interdiction section, it's a Miami Vice period of your career, were you aware that there were other conflicts going on around the world? And how did you end up getting involved in that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, while I was on the Boutwell, the tactical law enforcement team out of San Diego, they were sending people over to the Persian Gulf because there was UN sanctions against Iraq. I think it was Resolution 661, 665, where basically only medical supplies or food could get to Iraq. The Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf was mined, so there was no commercial traffic. So for them to get humanitarian supplies and food, you went up the Red Sea, they stopped in Aqaba, Jordan, and then they landlined it to Iraq. So they set up picket lines in the northern Red Sea, and you would board boats. So this is before I went and did that, but they were asking for volunteers to supplement these boarding teams. So I thought I was volunteering to go over to the Persian Gulf, but they wanted volunteers to take their normal Southern California drug patrols so they could go over to the Persian Gulf. So we went down there and spent 6 weeks, going to Mexico and doing that, and did a whole lot of fishing and not much else. Because, most of the drug lanes, at least back then, they were in the Caribbean. They weren't coming up through, at least via ocean. There's a lot of smuggling through Mexico and stuff into California, but it's mostly overland. It's not, at least back then it was.
This is roughly what period of time? 1980?
This is 90.
90, okay.
90,
Yeah.
90, 91.
Okay.
So then shortly thereafter, I transferred to Key West. And they were calling out, again, boarding teams, and I think we were on phase 5 or phase 6 of this. And so our team volunteered, and we went. So again, you're getting orders, here, go to Philadelphia, get this plane, and we're flying you to Hurghada, Egypt. And so we flew into Hurghada, Egypt, and got underway on a Navy ship, the USS Capodanno, which was a frigate, and there were 4 of us. And we trained the Navy to do VBSS, which is Visit, Board, Search, and Seize. Because at the time, the Navy really didn't have any experience with boardings. They hadn't done boardings. The reason why the Coast Guard is a little bit different than the Navy, the Coast Guard functions under Title 10 and Title 14. So Title 14 covers the U.S. military. Title 10 allows us to enforce U.S. federal law. Because of posse comitatus, the U.S. military cannot enforce U.S. federal law. That's martial law, can't do it. So we're under Title 10 and Title 14. So that's why the Coast Guard can do maritime law enforcement as the lead federal agency for maritime law enforcement in the United States. So we would get on board, and they would have about 12-person boarding teams, because we would actually be boarding container ships. So we'd have to teach them, you have your climbing gear on, because the containers couldn't be stacked more than 4 high. But 4 high is still pretty high. So what you would do when you did these boardings, you went and you talked to the first mate, and you say, let me see your cargo manifest and your bill of lading. And then you would just spot check, and you go, okay, we're going to check 20 of your containers today. And you would just randomly pick them out on their schematic, and then you'd go find them, and then you'd cut open the locks and the seals, and you'd open them up, and you'd make sure that they only had humanitarian supplies in them. But kind of the funny thing about that is you were enforcing UN sanctions. You weren't enforcing U.S. federal law, which is a whole different ballgame because they're U.S. citizens and there's a Constitution in the United States. But there you're enforcing UN sanctions, so you could pretty much do what you want, and a lot of people pretended they didn't speak English. So we pop open a container, and it's a bunch of wooden crates, and it's from Vietnam. And we're talking to the first mate, and he's no speaking, he's pretending. So at that point, if you're enforcing U.S. federal law, you'd have to go, okay, sir, for the safety of me and my boarding team and space accountability, I'm going to need to see what's in there. And when you're in the northern Red Sea, you go get the sledgehammer. Just go. So you start swinging that sledgehammer, busting a couple of those cracks. He can speak English really fast. Suddenly he understands everything you're saying. But again, that was really weird doing boardings there because we never felt in danger there, even though the war was going on. Because sometimes a SEAL team would surreptitiously be with you. the Navy helicopter's in the air with machine guns out of both sides, and you've got this Navy frigate with guns and torpedoes sitting right off their quarter. So, when you get on board, you're going, well, nothing's really going to happen here. Plus, it's not you're not boarding a military vessel, you're boarding a commercial ship. But really, the biggest bust we ever had over there is we popped open a container and they had air conditioners. So, couldn't have air conditioners, but the boat was back the next day, because what these boats would do is you'd turn the whole ship around, and they just go over the horizon, dump that container over, and they're back the next morning, and you're like, what'd you do with that container? We offloaded it. Where? Where did you offload it in the last 7.5 hours? And you knew exactly what they did, but again, it's not U.S. waters. Again, if it's U.S. waters and they're dumping shit overboard, plastic, oil, again, we've got some regulatory measures that we can enforce. Over there, they could be dumping oil off the fantail, and there's nothing you can do about it. And then after we were in the Red Sea, then we went to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and we were training their forces on how to do boardings. So we just kind of hopscotched around via helo. Like, we'd go out to a naval aircraft carrier, spend the night. They'd helo us into Qatar. We'd spend a couple of days there, and we'd go back, and then they'd take us to Saudi Arabia or whatever.
Yeah, unlike Japan or some of these other Australian waters, you couldn't exactly get off the boat in Saudi Arabia and go to a bar and have a beer, though, right? No, you couldn't. However, within the compound, the embassy compound that you stayed in, there was beer, and there was liquor, and I think that you got, I can't remember what it was. We didn't get it because we weren't permanent party there, but I think you could either get 1 bottle a week or like a 12-pack a week. It was pretty tightly regulated. But you just make friends with some of them, so, but yeah, everybody says, oh, there's no liquor in Saudi Arabia. There's liquor in Saudi Arabia, but I guess if you're on the embassy compound, it's U.S. soil, so I guess, but, so yeah, you can definitely do that, but, and then the one thing we did get a chance to do, we got to tour the pyramids. So we did pull into Hurghada, and we're on a Navy ship, and part of their morale welfare trip, they were having a bus trip to go see the pyramids. So we piggybacked on their tour, and that was really cool, seeing the Cairo Museum, seeing the pyramids, the Sphinx, going around there. But then the week after we went, there was a terrorist explosion on I think it was a German tourist bus. And so we'd made it in by a week. After that, the Navy canceled. They canceled all tours. So pretty much you'd pull into Hurghada, which is still a big town. There were restaurants and so, you could do things there, but it wasn't, you weren't leaving Hurghada. And then shortly after that, like I say, we went to Bahrain, which is the only Gulf state that does have legal booze. And so they've got bars and stuff there. But like I say, a lot of times when you're doing boarding, the boardings, when we're doing, you're doing from dawn to dusk. You're just getting as many in as you can because you want to spot check as many ships as you can. And then when you're training, you're starting early in the morning because they want to get through as many of their teams. But of course, there's all some cultural sensitivities, which we didn't know about at the time. But or I guess there was, they eat with one hand and they wipe with the other. So you start waving around the wrong hand, it's bad. Showing them the bottom of your foot is like flipping them off. So, when I train in front of an audience, I'm moving my hands. When I'm sitting there, like my turn's over, and I'll just sit down and someone else is, doing another thing. I tend to do this. So, a lot of times we have to be telling you okay, just keep your hands in your lap and keep your feet on the ground, and let's not create an international incident here. So was that pretty much your experience in the Middle East conflicts then?
Mm-hmm.
Was that period?
That was it. Maritime. We were part of the Maritime Interdiction Force, enforcing UN sanctions against Iraq.
Yeah. So what happened? What was your next step from there?
Well, I went to OCS, so that was I was still in. I was still enlisted. I know we're kind of bopping around, but so I was an E6, a first class petty officer at the time. They got rid of the sonar techs. Right. What am I going to do?
You got out of OCS, and then where'd you go from there?
I went to another Coast Guard Cutter Sherman. That's when I was a student engineer.
Oh, okay. All right. Then from there?
So then from there, I was wondering what I was going to do, because most of the engineering officers in training, once they graduate and become qualified, most of them are engineers. So there is a naval engineer career path in the Coast Guard, which I didn't have because I didn't have my degrees in sociology. So I'm looking around, and the Coast Guard has marine safety offices. And at these marine safety offices, there are marine inspectors. And there are deck inspectors, and there's engineering inspectors. So anything that carries people or freight for hire in U.S. waters, whether you're flagged U.S. or not, the Coast Guard has authority and jurisdiction on you. So these are big commercial ships that we board. So I said, that sounds kind of interesting. So that's where I went to New Orleans. And again, it's a 2-year training program to become a marine inspector. So that's what I did in New Orleans. So we would go out to the anchorages. You would see a boat. Okay, let's board that one. You'd go out there and you would, again, check all their, again, it's not a U.S. flag vessel. So basically, safety of life at sea, treaty, all the international treaties that all these countries are signatory to in order to come into U.S. waters. You know, they have to have a vessel safety certificate, they have to have a vessel construction certificate, but they're issued by the classification society that issues those certificates. So the U.S., the Coast Guard issues those, or the American Bureau of Shipping can issue those for U.S. flag ships. But, you know, you'll have Lloyd's registry is one. So you'll go on board, you'll look at all their paperwork, make sure everything's up to date, and then you'll do an inspection. So you'll check the fire, you check the fire main, make sure it's not leaking water. You'll look at the life rafts, make sure there's no, or lifeboats, and there's no holes in them. You'll make sure that the life rafts have been serviced, that they are meeting the manning standards. So you're also looking for International Labor Organization conditions. A lot of these boats were infested with vermin or cockroaches, so that's why they had to anchor out. We don't want them touching U.S. soil. So if a boat was really bad, you would just say, you got to fumigate this. We're not, we deny entry to you unless you get this thing cleaned up. So a lot of times, yeah, you go on board a boat, and normally these boat boardings would take about 6 or 7 hours. So you're normally there over lunch, but we always had like a secret code, because the first place that we would always send someone to inspect was the galley. Because if you get on board that boat at 8, you know you're going to be there for lunch. And, you know, he'd come back up, and if he or she, you know, you'd come back up, and if they got the, we don't want to eat lunch here, you get the sign. Because they would always offer to have lunch. And you just say, no, we're in a hurry. We just want to knock out this inspection. But some of the best food I've had on some of these foreign flag ships, I mean, you know, they're serving stuff I would never think to order this, but that's what's on the menu. Okay, I'll try it. So that was great. Again, a lot of cultures, you know, then a lot of friction too among the boats, because the crew members, like a lot of these, if it's a Greek ship, you'll have Greek officers, but you'll have Filipino sailors. So you look at the officer staterooms, they're all really nice and clean, and they're eating food. Then you go down to the crew's quarters, and I see broken toilets and stuff like that. But that's when you really can go, hey, Captain, you got to fix it. You know, you can't have your crew living in squalor. Well, you guys are up here. So a lot of times, you know, you do a little bit of good. And then if you actually detain a vessel, you can have what they call a captain of the port order put on a boat if it's substandard. And then you just tie them up till they get it fixed. So we boarded a boat one time. He's coming up the Mississippi River. He doesn't have an anchor. You're like, what? Where's your anchor? It fell off. Well, you know, you can't leave. You can't leave until you get an anchor. And then the company that owned this ship, they ended up going bankrupt. So these poor guys, they're sitting on this boat. They barely have enough food and water. So we would go back and check up on them every now and then. They end up 3 or 4 months till they finally got enough money to get an anchor so they could get underway and go back. And then, you know, and then you can always put boats on a no-fly list. You know, you can just say, okay, this boat right here, you're not coming into the U.S. at all. So that's what I did when I was in New Orleans. Then after New Orleans, I went to Portland, Maine, and basically did the same thing up there. But interesting, in Portland, Maine, you know, there's a lot of 100-year-old wooden schooners that are still carrying people out for hire. And on a commercial boat or a passenger ship, you know, you have certain standards when it comes to intact stability, structural fire protection and stuff, but these boats are all grandfathered in. So you're going on board a wooden boat that's carrying people for hire that has a wood stove that they're cooking on. So the first time you go, this can't be right. You go, well, you know, the boat was built in 1892, so the Coast Guard regs didn't exist back then. So, you know, you do the best you can. And most of these boats, I mean, they're in fantastic shape. I mean, the people that own and run these boats, they're wood knockers from way back. They're true sailors that know, you know, the safety with the fastenings and the planks. But because it takes a lot of times regulations to catch up with technology, if they're replacing part of the hull or part of the deck, if the plank, you know, you're not supposed to be able to have a short plank, you know, but these days, where are you going to find a 90-foot piece of Douglas fir to replace this one plank? It just doesn't exist. So you would just work as an inspector. You would come up with a equivalent equivalency that was met pretty much the Coast Guard safety standards as well as, with their safety standard, just to ensure the safety of the passengers. Because, that's the most precious resource that you have. And speaking of, if you look at any kind of commercial vessel, the cruise ships make the most money. So the captains are the most experienced and get paid the best. Then you go down to chemical tankers. Still, you have a ship with a bunch of different chemicals, some that react badly with each other. So cargo segregation is a big thing. They get paid pretty good. Oil tankers are pretty good. You get down to the captains that are carrying a load of dirt or rock. You could just look at the hierarchy of ships. Depending on what ship you board, you just know, hey, this guy's been carrying gravel for the last 12 years. But, that's what you don't get a chance to pick what you're doing. After Portland, Maine, when I was in Portland, Maine, 9/11 happened. So between the group and the Marine Safety Office, they kind of got together, and we had a Homeland Security Planning Committee that we kind of chaired up just so the operational units, because the way the group was, the small boats in Portland Harbor are owned by the group that had a group commander. But the captain of the port authority and the Federal On-Scene Coordinator and the Federal Maritime Security Coordinator statutory titles belong with the captain of the port, who's the commanding officer of the Marine Safety Office. So the group had the toys, they had the weapons, they had the ships, but they didn't have the authorities. And again, we're in U.S. federal waters, we have to abide by the Constitution. So, but the statutory authority was with the Marine Safety Office. So we had to mesh them together. But, at that point, you have two commanding officers that one, I won't say her name, well, I'm not gonna mention anybody's name, but she outranked my boss. And she wanted to be the captain of the port, but the statutory authority is vested with the commanding officer of the Marine Safety Office, not the group commander, even though she's a captain and he's only a commander at the time. So there's button heads, and at the time I'm just a lieutenant. So, you're kind of stuck in the middle trying to be this arbiter of things going, well, we got to secure the harbor. So that was one of the issues why the Coast Guard structurally changed to what they call sectors. We can get in that in a little bit, but we really did have a command and control problem when 9/11 happened for that same reason. One person had all the authorities, and the other person had the operational units to carry out those authorities. And they weren't necessarily all on the same page because, your orders at after 9/11 happened, after a couple hours, what are your marching orders at that point? Secure Portland Harbor. Okay, everyone's got a different idea on how to secure the harbor. So again, the group commander, she's got one way she wants to do it. The captain of the MSO, the commander of the MSO, he's got another idea. So, just getting that back together. So what the Coast Guard has done since then, they've gotten what they call sectors together. So basically they merged both those units together. So now there's one person in charge. So you don't have the head knocking anymore between those groups and the Marine Safety Office.
We're running close to your 2 o'clock, and so what finally made the decision to leave the Coast Guard?
Kids moving around. Both my kids go to high school here. It gets to the point, when your kids are young, and I was 35 years old when I got married. My wife was 31, so we got married late and had kids late. Obviously. Moving's pretty easy, except for their little kids. But, the last couple moves that we made, there's tears, there's crying, I don't want to move, I hate you. So, I was stationed here, I was the commanding officer here in Grand Haven. And then, so we really liked Western Michigan. So after I went to the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, I got stationed in Washington, D.C. And after that tour was over, we wanted to get back here, but I had outranked the job that was available here. So the closest place was Sault Ste. Marie. So I was the deputy sector commander up in Sault Ste. Marie, and my wife and kids are going, we're not moving to Sault Ste. Marie. So in 2009, when we got stationed back here, we bought a house here in Grand Haven, and they settled here, and I had a little apartment up in Sault Ste. Marie. And, would be able to get home a couple times a month, but spend a lot of time away from them. So that was pretty much the last tour. I knew they weren't moving, and I didn't want the kids to move. I knew too many friends of mine, their kids moved mid-high school. I think it's probably the worst thing in the world. You just get through your junior, you got to spend your senior year at a brand new high school. I didn't want to do that to my daughter. She's a senior this year. So yeah, I just said, it's just not worth it, because I was probably going back to Washington, D.C. And I hated being stationed in Washington, D.C. yeah, my tour was up, and it was time to go. Plus, yeah, I think you realize it too. I think most people you talk to in the military that spend a time or retire, and everyone always said this to me: you're just going to wake up one day, and you're going to go, it's time to retire. And that did happen to me. I just woke up one morning, I'm looking around my little one-bedroom apartment up there, and I'm going, I don't want to do this any longer. So called up the captain. It was a Sunday morning. Called him up. Hey, Captain, I'm putting in my papers Monday. He's like, why? What's his name? I said, no, nothing's wrong. Because as an officer in that job, you have to give basically a year's notice. You just can't give 2 weeks' notice. So you've got to submit your paperwork, and then Office Personnel Management has got to approve it. And again, needs of the service, they could either deny it or they could accept it or whatever, so.
Looking back, how do you think your experience in the Coast Guard affected you or made you the person you are today?
No, I think it has everything to do with it. I mean, I've been retired since 2013 now, but I mean, I still bleed blue. It's cool living in Coast Guard City, USA, when you're in the Coast Guard or retired from the Coast Guard, living here. But I know pretty much. I mean, like I say, I was bartending. Here I have a degree in sociology, and I can't get a job. I can make twice as much money tending bar. And so, at that point, you're 25 years old. You're going, yeah, I got to do something. I can't be. I don't want to be a 40-year-old bartender. So yeah, just luck of the draw. Again, driving by, signed up, and again, I would have bet you $1 million. When I first joined, I'd have bet you $1 million. No way, I'm staying in for 20 years. I'm serving one hitch. I'm getting some GI Bill money. I'm going to go back to school. That's my plan. But then, every year you stay in, you re-enlist, get some bonus money. Then suddenly you've got 8 or 9 or 10 years, and you go, shit, I only got 10 more years to go. I can retire. Then you hit 20, and you go, well, okay, maybe I'll stick around a little bit more. So then your retirement check goes up. It goes up 2.5% every year over 20. And then it comes time to pull the plug.